It is late, and the room is dark, and somewhere near your hand a small rectangle of glass is glowing. You know the shape of this moment, the soft light, the low hum of a house at night, the screen answering before you have finished asking. There may be a cup going cold nearby, a charger cable twisted across the sheet, some ordinary object catching the glow and looking, for no good reason, suddenly too bright. And all around you, though you cannot feel it, the air is full of messages. Signals move through the walls. They pass through your body without stopping, thousands of them, carrying voices and pictures and words meant for other people, other houses, other hands. Above the roof, above the clouds, satellites drift in slow circles, listening, relaying, connecting one lit window to another across the curve of the earth. We built all of this in a single lifetime, a web of light and signal thrown around the whole planet so that no one need ever be truly out of reach again. We have never been more reachable. A word typed here can arrive on the other side of the planet before the next breath leaves your chest. We carry the voices of distant friends in our pockets. We pass our evenings inside a web of invisible connection so dense that we have stopped noticing it at all. Still, something older has gone quiet. We can send a message across an ocean, but many of us can no longer read the weather by the smell of the air. We cannot name the stars turning above our own street. We are uneasy in real darkness, the kind with no glow at the edges, and most of us go years without ever meeting it. We do not notice when the birds change their calls, or when an animal falls still, or when the light shifts in a way that once meant rain by morning. Often we cannot even feel our own bodies until they are already in pain. We miss the small signals, the tightening, the tiredness, the low unease, until they grow loud enough to interrupt us. We have learned to override the body, to push past it, to treat it as a vehicle that should simply keep running while our attention lives somewhere else, up in the bright noise of the screen. That is not stupidity. It is just the weather of this century. One kind of attention slowly replaced another, and no one stopped at the door to tell us a trade was being made. Signal is everywhere now. The older signals are the ones we learn to treat as background noise. The strange part is how politely this loss behaves. Nothing breaks, the lights stay on, messages keep arriving. A person can live for years in a city and never see the stars properly, then still feel that nothing is missing, because the streetlight glow has quietly taken the sky's place. So the loss is small enough to miss at first. Not a catastrophe, more like a dimmer switch turned down over years. From there, the older stories begin to look different. When we imagine something lost, some older, wiser layer of human life, we usually give it walls. A city of stone beneath the waves, a temple swallowed by jungle, its carvings blurred by rain, a map folded into an old story, waiting for someone patient enough to read it. Those images are powerful. They pull at something in us. Drowned kingdoms, ruined temples with the names worn off, a coastline that was once dry land, now dark water, holding whatever it held. The stories return in every age, in every language, and they never quite leave us alone. We do not have to prove those stories here, or take them apart piece by piece. That is another kind of work, and probably a louder one. So the path turns narrower, away from proof and toward attention. The suspicion underneath this whole journey is smaller than that, and stranger. The deepest loss may never have been a place at all. A city under the waves would be easier to imagine. So would a machine under sand, or a secret technology waiting for its name to be spoken again. What faded may have been less glamorous and much closer, the habit of perceiving the world with the whole body. Attention is probably the nearest word, though it is a little too clean. Listening comes closer. What I mean is the old sensitivity to sky, ground, animals, weather, faces. The kind of human skill that goes soft when no one has to use it for a while. And a sense that goes unpracticed does not leave a ruin behind. That is what makes it so hard to see. A drowned city leaves stone on the seabed. A lost way of paying attention leaves nothing at all. Only its absence. Only the quiet where it used to be. You cannot excavate it. You can only try to remember that it was ever there. So this will not be a claim that ancient people had magic in their hands, or voices in the air, or powers that science has somehow missed. We do not have to pretend certainty where there is only mystery. That is not the journey. We are here for something slower and, I think, stranger. The question is plain enough to carry. Before asking what ancient people knew, we should ask what modern people stopped noticing. It is a little like following a faint path at dusk. Press too hard and you lose it, but ignore it, and it is gone anyway. It is a gentler question than it first appears. It does not ask us to believe anything. It only asks us to look at what has quietly slipped out of reach, and to wonder what it might have felt like to still hold it. The first lost temple may be much closer than the seabed, the body you are sitting in right now. The first lost archive may not be carved in stone. It may be memory itself. The long, patient kind that lived in people who could not write anything down, and so had to hold the world inside them. And the oldest signal of all may not have come from any tower. It was the quiet exchange that once passed between one nervous system and another, between a person and an animal, reading each other across a clearing, between a body and the weather, feeling the pressure change hours before the storm, between someone awake and someone asleep, and the strange knowledge people once believed the dreamer could carry back. These are not powers exactly. That is the wrong word, and we will come back to why. They're closer to forms of attention, ways of being tuned to the world. And attention, unlike a buried city, leaves nothing behind. It has to be practiced, or it fades. It has to be handed down, or it is simply gone. The path moves roughly like a breath. First, inward, into the body, into the space between a mother and a child, into the circle of people gathered around a fire. We will ask whether the human body was once a far more sensitive instrument than modern life allows it to be. Then outward, towards stone and sky, drowned coastlines, and the old stories that will not quite leave us alone. Near the end, we return to the body in the dark room, holding its small square of light. Nothing here has to be solved all at once. It is enough for now to notice the direction of the path. For now we begin in the oldest place there is. No temple or monument yet. No ruin. We begin before language, before writing, before the first stone was ever set on another. We begin with the first conversation any of us ever had, the silent one, between a newborn and the body that held it. A baby cannot speak, which is obvious until you notice how much still gets understood. Look at that ordinary fact again, the way you might look at something you have seen 1,000 times and never really studied. A newborn has no words, no language, no grammar, no name for hunger or cold or fear. It cannot tell you what it needs. It cannot point. It cannot explain. And the person holding that baby cannot read its mind. There is no window into those thoughts, no direct line, nothing that could honestly be called mind reading. Even so, something passes between them from the very first hour. The baby cries in a certain way, and the body of the person holding it answers before the thinking mind has caught up. A change in the pitch of that cry and they are already moving. A slight stiffening of the small body, a particular kind of stillness, and they know, not in words, but in the hands, that something is wrong. A parent learns the hungry cry, the tired cry, the cry that means something is wrong, over long days and longer nights. No book teaches it cleanly. It is learned with milk on a shirt, hair stuck to a forehead at 3 a.m, one hand searching in the dark before the mind has formed a thought. Ask how they know, and they may only shrug. The knowledge sits lower than sentences, in the hands and ears and some older part of attention, and the baby in turn is learning them. The rhythm of a walk it is carried in, the warmth of the skin it lies against, a particular smell it can already pick out from across a room, the sound of a heartbeat it knew from the inside, from before it was born, the first steady rhythm it ever lived beside, months before it ever saw a face. Long before grammar, communication is already happening. It uses smell and touch and warmth. It uses breath and milk and the steady drum of a heartbeat. It uses the tone of a voice long before the meaning of any sentence. The baby responds to how the words are said months before it has any idea what they mean. It uses eye contact and the tiny movements of a face, and the way tension gathers or melts out of a pair of shoulders. A whole conversation, carried on entirely below the level of language, and none the poorer for it. Before language, the body is already speaking, and another body is already listening. We tend not to think of this as remarkable, because it is everywhere, because it happened to every single one of us. But step back, and it becomes one of the strangest and most beautiful things about being human. A newborn enters the world unfinished, helpless in a way that few other creatures are. A foal stands within hours of being born. A newborn deer can run. But a human infant arrives long before it is ready, soft-boned and unfocused, unable to walk, unable to feed itself, unable to flee or even to cling for long. Some biologists have described human infancy almost as a continuation of formation outside the womb, not finished in isolation, but in someone's arms. And that unfinished openness is not just weakness. It is also why we are so shaped by whoever holds us. We come into the world porous, ready to be written on, waiting to be tuned by another person. And into that openness comes another person. For the newborn, that person is not simply a caregiver. That person is the whole environment, the first world. A face becomes weather, bright or clouded, warm or distant. Long before the baby can name an emotion, it can feel one arrive across that face and change the temperature of the whole world. A voice becomes shelter, or the loss of it. A heartbeat becomes the first sense of direction, the fixed point around which everything else arranges itself. The infant does not learn the world through ideas, it learns the world through another body. It reads safety and danger, calm and alarm, presence and absence, all through the nervous system of the person holding it. When that person is calm, the baby settles. When that person is frightened, the baby feels it, even in a dark room, even with nothing said. The fear travels body to body, with no words to carry it. That is the part worth slowing down over. We sometimes reach for a dramatic word to describe a deep, wordless closeness between two people. We call it telepathy. We imagine thoughts flying invisibly through the air, one mind speaking directly into another. But watch a mother and a newborn for an afternoon, and you may start to wonder if we've been imagining the wrong thing. The first form of telepathy, if we use the word carefully, was not thought moving through the air. It was one nervous system learning how to read another. Not magic in the cheap sense, older than that and harder to dismiss, precisely because it is ordinary, true, and happening in rooms all over the world. The people who study this bond have quieter words for it. They talk about attunement, about synchrony. They describe how a parent and an infant can fall into step with each other. In their behaviour, in their timing, and even, it seems, in the rhythms of the body itself. Heart rates that drift toward each other, attention that locks and moves together, two separate systems gradually beginning to act as something closer to one. The distinction matters. No thoughts have to leap between skulls. Two bodies stay close for long enough, learn each other well enough, and eventually the reading becomes almost invisible. From the outside, it can still look like something more. A mother wakes a moment before her baby cries. A father feels, across a crowded room, that something has shifted with his child and turns at exactly the right time. We call these moments small miracles. They may also be the ordinary result of two nervous systems that have spent months learning each other until the reading has dropped below language, below even the level of noticing. The wonder does not disappear when we explain it this way. If anything, it lands closer to home. The mystery does not shrink when seen this way. It comes closer. If this is where every one of us begins, as a body learning to read another body, then it may not be a skill we outgrow. It may be the ground floor of being human, the first language underneath all our later languages. Perhaps, long before we were speakers, we were readers of one another. Bodies reading bodies. Nervous systems tuned to nervous systems in the dark by feel. It is a strange thought to carry, and a warm one, that underneath every conversation we have ever had, every argument and every explanation, there is this older channel still running quietly, the one we opened on the first day of our lives and never entirely closed. And if that is true for two, for a mother and her child alone in the quiet, then a question opens softly, like a door left ajar. What happens when it is not two bodies but many? What happens when a whole group of people gather in one place, around one fire, and hear the same drum, and move to the same rhythm, and feel the same fear rise and fall together? If two nervous systems can learn to read each other, what might 100 do? Start with a fire because the rest of the scene gathers around it. Night has come down over a landscape with no other lights in it. No towns glowing on the horizon, no lamp in any window, because there are no windows, and no towns. Only the dark and the cold coming up out of the ground, and in the middle of it, a fire. People are gathered around it. Faces lift out of the dark and then disappear again when someone turns away. Smoke gets into hair and eyes. A child scratches at a bite on one ankle. Someone coughs, someone laughs too loudly, and then the circle settles back into listening. Heat presses on the front of the body while the night leans against the back. Beyond the circle, the dark is complete and full of sound. The small movements of animals, the wind in whatever grows nearby. Inside the circle there is fire, and there are faces, and there is the sense of being, for now, safe. And somewhere in that circle a sound begins. It may be a drum. It may only be hands, feet, or voices. Whatever starts it, the rhythm is shared. Ancient life is often reduced to tools, hunts, cave paintings. But this scene mattered too. People together in the dark, moving as one. A tribe was not just a loose pile of individuals living in the same area. On some nights it must have worked more like a body with many skins, a nervous system spread around the fire. Think about what a fire circle actually does. A story is told there and told again across the years, until everyone in the circle knows it by heart, knows when the frightening part is coming, knows when to lean in, knows exactly when to breathe. The story becomes a shared rhythm, held in many bodies at once. A song rises, and voices join it, and the separate people begin to sound like one voice. Feet find the same beat against the ground. Hands clap into the same pattern. The drum enters the chest, not as something heard, but as something felt, a pulse that everyone in the circle is now sharing. And slowly, without anyone deciding it, the group begins to move together, to feel together, to become for a while more than a crowd of separate selves. There is a moment in this, if you've ever been inside it, that is difficult to describe afterward, a point where you stop keeping time and the time starts keeping you, where your own clapping, your own voice, your own breath is no longer quite yours. It has joined something, and the something is carrying you along. People have chased that feeling for as long as there have been people. They have built whole ceremonies around finding it again. The temptation is to dress this up as magic, but we do not need to. We do not need to invent an invisible force to explain it. The experience itself is enough, and it is real. The synchrony was not just beautiful, it was useful. Perhaps one of the oldest survival tools we ever had. Consider what a group like this can do that a lone person cannot. One person, at the edge of the firelight, sees a shape move in the dark. Their body changes, a stiffening, a sharp turn of the head, a held breath. And because everyone is attuned, because these bodies have spent their whole lives reading one another, the alarm passes through the whole group almost instantly. No one has to explain. One cry in the dark can reorganize every body around the fire in a single heartbeat. That shared attention was protection. Many eyes, many ears, one linked response. A single person must rest, look away, miss things. A group tuned to one another never fully closes its eyes. The watchfulness is spread across many bodies and passed between them without a word. But it went further than danger. The same rhythm that could sharpen a group into alertness could also do the opposite. It could calm fear. It could carry grief. A slow, shared song can hold a frightened group steady, the way a hand holds a shaking shoulder. When someone died, the circle could grieve together, in rhythm, and no one had to carry the weight alone. The drumming that prepared hunters, the singing that welcomed a birth, the low chant that sat with the dead, the swaying dance that marked the turning of a season, all of it worked on the same principle. Many bodies, moving as one, many separate rhythms, falling for a while into a single beat. And it did something else too, something quieter than survival. It bound people to each other across time. A song you sang beside your grandmother in the same rhythm she had sung. Beside hers was not just a song, it was a thread. Through it, the dead were still in the circle. The rhythm was a form of memory that didn't need writing, a way of carrying the whole line of people who had come before, held in the body and passed hand to hand, voice to voice, generation to generation. And this is the part that brings it close to us. We still do this. We have never actually stopped. You feel it in a crowd at a concert, when thousands of strangers sing the same line at the same moment and something rises in the room that no single person put there. You feel it in a stadium, in a protest, in a congregation, in a dance. Whole industries exist now to sell us brief returns to that old feeling. A few hours once in a while of moving as one body again, and you feel it in the oldest, smallest version of all. A parent swaying in a dark room, humming a lullaby, until two nervous systems settle into one slow rhythm and a child finally softens. The fire circle has not vanished. It has only grown small, moved indoors, and most nights it holds just two. The energy of a crowd is a real experience. We do not have to call it supernatural to take it seriously. Something genuine happens when human bodies synchronize. You can feel the mood of a room turn, feel a crowd become generous or become dangerous, feel a silence fall over thousands of people at once as though a single hand had passed over them. We were, it seems, built to do it. The capacity is still in us, intact, waiting for the right fire. What has changed is not the ability. It is how rarely we use it, and how thin the occasions have become, which turns the whole idea of a lost power gently on its head. When we imagine what ancient people might have had and lost, We often imagine power over the world, the ability to command a storm, to move a stone with the mind, to bend nature toward a human will. The older power, if that word still fits, was humbler. The lost power was not command over nature. It was belonging to it, together. To sit in a circle and feel the boundary between yourself and the person beside you grow thin. To become, for one night, part of something larger than your single, separate life. To be held by a rhythm older than any of the people keeping it. We spend a great deal of our lives defending the edges of the self. Perhaps the oldest comfort was the chance now and then to let those edges soften. So already, before we have touched a single ruin, before we have looked up at a single star, that older signal has surfaced 3 times. It surfaced first in the quiet body, listening through skin and breath, then between a mother and child, 2 nervous systems learning each other without a word, and now around the fire, where many separate people become briefly one body in the dark. Laid side by side, these modest scenes begin to look larger. A body that feels the weather, a parent who knows a cry, a group that moves as one. No metal bends, no future is read, but a picture starts to form. Human beings once lived more finely tuned to one another and to the world than our separate screen-lit evenings suggest. The body, the pair, the circle. No magic is hiding there. Each scene is real, human, close enough to touch. Each one has also grown quieter, a little more forgotten with every generation that spends its evenings apart, in separate rooms, in separate pools of glassy light. But we're not finished inside the body yet. Before we follow the old roads outward, toward standing stones and drowned coastlines, and the patient movement of the stars, we have to stay a little longer within the human form itself. Many ancient traditions then make a stranger claim, one that keeps returning in different forms across the world. They seem to have believed that the first sacred place was never built from stone at all. They believed it was already here, closer than any temple, the throat where words catch before we can say them, the chest that tightens with grief and opens with relief, the belly where fear arrives before the mind has named it, the spine, the breath, the slow pulse under everything, places in the body where fear and grief and speech and desire and memory all seem to gather, as if the body were a map of something, as if it had always been the first temple, and that is where we will go next. Think of the last time you had something difficult to say, not a small thing, something that mattered, a truth you had been holding, a word you were afraid of, a name you did not want to speak out loud. You may remember where you felt it, not in your thoughts, in your throat. A tightness there, a closing, a sense of something gathering just below the jaw, right where a voice is made, as if the body had reached up and held the words back before they could leave, buying you a moment you had not asked for. We say we get a lump in the throat, and we say it so easily that we forget how strange it is. The feeling is real. It has location, and it arrives before we have decided anything at all. The temple here is not made of stone. It is the one we carry everywhere. There is a quiet claim running underneath all of this, that many ancient traditions seem to treat the body itself as the first sacred place. It is easy to hear something like that and file it away as poetry, a nice image, nothing more. But stay with it a moment longer, and it becomes harder to dismiss. We do not just think our feelings, we feel them in specific places, again and again, in ways that are oddly consistent from person to person and culture to culture. Grief sits in the chest. It presses there, a weight behind the ribs, real enough that we reach up and rub the spot without thinking. We call it heartache, and we mean it almost literally. The ache is right there, where we point. And when it finally lifts, we feel the chest open and the breath comes easier, and only then do we realise how long we'd been holding it. We did not invent that on purpose. No one taught it to us. It simply happens, in bodies all over the world. Fear arrives lower down, in the belly. It arrives there before we understand it. A drop, a coldness, a knot. The body sounding an alarm while the mind is still catching up, still asking what is wrong. Shame heats the face. Longing aches somewhere under the breastbone, and a certain kind of dread runs straight up the spine, as though the back knew, before the front of us did, that something had changed in the room. There is more. The body seems to hold on to things the mind would rather move past. A smell can return you to a childhood kitchen in an instant, whole and complete, faster than any memory you could summon on purpose. A song can bring back a person you have not thought of in years. Some griefs seem to live in the shoulders. Some fears keep their grip long after we have decided, up in the reasoning mind, that we are safe. It is ordinary, which may be why we overlook it. It is happening in you, quietly, most days. Watch the breath too while this happens. It is never neutral. Fear makes it shallow and quick, high up in the chest. Grief can catch it, so that it comes in small broken pieces. Calm lets it drop lower and slow down. Before we have said a single word about how we feel, the breath has already announced it. Taken together, this means something. Long before philosophy, long before writing, the human body was already mapping feeling onto itself, assigning places, drawing without ink a chart of where a life is felt. The body, then, was never only a body. Here, the ground needs to stay steady. Across many cultures, people took this intuition and built it into something larger. They drew maps of the inner human being, systems of centres and channels and layers and thresholds. You've probably heard of some of them. In parts of India, there's the idea of chakras, centres arranged along the vertical axis of the body, from its base to the crown of the head, each linked to certain qualities of life. The axis matters. The body read as a line running upward from ground to sky, with a whole life arranged along it. In Chinese traditions there is the dantian, a centre of vital energy held low in the belly, and a wider system of channels running through the body. In Sufi practice there are the lataif, subtle points associated with stages of the heart's awakening. In the Kabbalah, the Sephirot form a kind of map, though one that describes the structure of reality as much as the body. They should not be flattened into one thing. These are not the same map. They come from different worlds, centuries, and questions. Blurring them into a single ancient wisdom would be a kind of disrespect. But step back, and something does connect them. Not the details, the instinct underneath. Again and again, in distant traditions, human beings arrived at similar intuition. The body is not just a bag of organs, it is a landscape. Meaning gathers in certain regions of it. The base, the belly, the heart, the throat, the space behind the eyes. And a human life can be understood, at least in part, by paying attention to those places. The plain part can be said gently. Modern anatomy does not find chakras as literal structures inside the body. They are not organs, not wheels that can be measured in a laboratory. And that is fine. That was likely never the point. The mistake is to ask the wrong question of them. To hold up an ancient map of the inner body, look for spinning wheels of energy, find nothing, and conclude the whole thing was nonsense. That is a little like dissecting a poem to find out whether the events in it really happened, and pronouncing it false when they did not. A map does not have to be literal to be true to something. The London Underground map is not geographically accurate. It distorts distance and direction completely, yet it tells the truth about how the system connects and how to move through it. In that sense, these inner maps become less strange, not anatomy, but experience. If many cultures drew maps of the inner human being, perhaps the map was pointing to something real, though not necessarily something mechanical, something about where we feel love and fear and grief, something about how a life moves through a body, something a modern scan will never show, because it is not that kind of thing. That is the quieter kind of truth these maps may have been trying to hold. The ancients did not have our anatomy. They could not look inside the living body the way we can. But they had long hours with no screen to soften the edges of discomfort, no instant distraction when grief pressed in the ribs or fear dropped into the stomach. They watched the body because there was nowhere else to put some of that attention, and they noticed patterns, where feeling gathered, how it moved, what opened the chest and what closed the throat. And they gave those patterns a shape and passed the shape down and refined it over centuries until it became a map. The first temple in this version is not a building. It is a trained attention to the places where life gathers inside us. And if the body was a temple, then it had doors. Some of those doors opened outward, into the world. But the ancients seemed just as interested in the ones that opened the other way, inward, downward, into the dark. We know these doors in a way. We pass through some of them without noticing, but the ancients seem to have studied them and named them and built practices around them, the way we might study anything we took to be important. And there was one threshold they returned to with a seriousness that is hard for us to imagine now. A door the body seemed to open on its own, every single night, the moment the waking mind finally let go. We step through it and forget it by morning. They treated it as a place one could enter on purpose and return from carrying something. Imagine arriving somewhere because you're sick or afraid, and the ordinary answers have run out. You've travelled some distance to get here. Days perhaps on foot or by cart with dust in your sandals, and the same worry waiting for you every morning when you wake. Not to a hospital. There is nothing quite like that yet. No clinic, no test, no clean little name for what is wrong. You have come to a temple. It sits in a quiet place, a little apart from the ordinary world. There are colonnades and lamps burning low, and the smell of oil and smoke and something green from the gardens. Water runs somewhere nearby. Many of these places were built beside springs. There are others here like you, carrying their own troubles, moving softly, speaking low, waiting for their turn. You may have been here for days already. That was part of it. You do not simply arrive and lie down. And you have not come for medicine, exactly. You have come for a dream. This actually happened for centuries across the ancient Greek and Roman world. People who were ill, or grieving, or simply lost would travel to the healing sanctuaries of Asclepios, the god associated with medicine. And the heart of the practice was strange to modern ears. They came there to lie down in the sacred dark, and to dream. The practice had a name, incubation, sometimes enkoimesis, but the words matter less than the shape of the thing. Before the dream, there was preparation. It was not the kind of rest someone falls into by accident after a long day. The person would wash, would make offerings, would eat certain things and not others, would move through rituals meant to purify the body and quiet the mind, sometimes over several days. They would let go, piece by piece, of the noise they had carried in, the journey, the worry, the ordinary chatter of a worried life. And only then, cleansed and calmed and holding their question, would they be led to the inner chamber. They would lie down on a simple bed in the sacred space, in the dark, among the soft sounds of others' breathing, and wait. They were not lying down to escape. They were lying down to become available to a dream that might bring healing, or a warning, or an instruction, or the sense that a god had drawn near in the night and touched them, or spoken, or shown them what to do. The distance from our own habits is sharp. For most of us now, a dream is treated as noise. We wake, and it is already dissolving. The phone is there, the room is too bright. Someone has sent a message, the cat wants food, the kettle needs filling, and whatever the night was trying to hand over is gone in the first minute. If we mention it at all, we half apologize for it. Just a weird dream. Probably nothing. There is no ritual around it, no preparation, no attention, no place set aside. The door still opens every night. We have simply stopped standing near it when it does. For the ancient world, a dream could be an event, something that happened to you, not just inside you, something worth travelling for, something worth building a temple around. We have not lost this entirely. We still say we need to rest on a decision, and we mean something real by it. That the morning mind sometimes knows things the evening mind could not reach. We have simply stopped building anything around the idea. We let it happen by accident, if it happens at all. Nobody can tell you now what really happened in those rooms, whether anyone was healed, whether the dreams did anything at all in the way we would measure doing. We have the inscriptions people left behind, the carved thank you notes to the god for cures received, but we cannot climb inside a single one of those nights. The details blur at the edges, the way they always do at this distance, but we do not have to settle that to see why it mattered. Think about what the practice gave people. A person arrives carrying something too large to hold, a sickness, a fear, a grief with no name, and the ritual takes that weight seriously. It says, this matters enough to prepare for, to travel toward, to bring before the gods. And then it offers a room, a dark, quiet room, and permission to lie still in it, and the belief that when the waking mind finally goes quiet, something else might speak. There is a kind of medicine in that, even if no illness is cured. To have your suffering taken seriously, to be given a ritual instead of a shrug, to be told that the thing you carry is worth the attention of the gods, and then to be handed a quiet place and time to listen for an answer. We spend a great deal of money now trying to buy back some version of that, the sense of being truly attended to. The old temples offered it as a matter of course. We often assume the ancients were simply mistaken about dreams, superstitious where we are informed, and in one narrow sense, maybe we do know more. We know a great deal about the dreaming brain that they could never have guessed. But notice what they had that we have mostly lost. They had a language for the inner life, a way of taking seriously the images that rise in the dark, a ritual container for fear and grief and hope, and the strange work the mind does when we are not watching it. For the ancient world, the dream was not always an escape from reality. Sometimes it was treated as another room inside reality, not less real than the waking world, differently real, a place with its own rules where different kinds of truth could be told, and there may be something to that, even now, even stripped of the gods. When the day's noise drops away, and the body lies still, and the ordinary managing mind loosens its grip, other things surface, memories set aside, feelings too inconvenient to feel, connections the daylight mind was too literal to make. The dream becomes a kind of inner theatre, a place where the things we carry can put on faces and act themselves out, where a fear can become a figure, a grief can become a landscape, a hope can walk toward us wearing someone's face. The ancients did not need our theories to notice this. They only had to pay attention to what the night gave back. A dream may have been one of the oldest ways the body learned to speak once the day had gone quiet. The ancients seem to have known this, not as a theory, but as a practice. They built the quiet on purpose. They made a place for it and a ritual around it, and they treated the results as worth listening to. A dark room, a still body, a question carried into the night, and the patience to wait for an answer. The dream was one doorway, but it was not the only one. The same people who took dreams seriously had noticed something else. A person did not always have to wait for night to change the shape of the mind. Other thresholds could be opened while wide awake, through breath, rhythm, and the oldest tools the body has ever had. Start with the one rhythm that has been with you the whole time. Breath is already there, plain and stubborn, doing its work whether or not anyone notices. It has been happening this whole time, under everything, keeping its own quiet rhythm. You did not have to arrange it, and most of the day you will never notice it once. But the breath has a strange property, and the ancients seem to have found it very early. It sits on a border. It is the one function of the body that runs on its own, and yet the moment you turn your attention to it, you can take the wheel. Slow it down, and something slows down with it. The racing mind eases. The edges of things soften, speed it up, or hold it, or move it in certain patterns, and the world can begin to feel different, lighter, or stranger, or further away. There is no need to make this mystical. Anyone who has ever taken a deep breath to steady themselves before a hard moment already knows the principle. We reach for it instinctively. A long exhale before we walk into the room. He held breath at the top of the stairs. The breath is a dial the body left within reach, and it is connected to more than we usually realize. It reaches down into the parts of us we do not normally control. The heartbeat, the tension in the gut, the alarm system that decides whether we are safe. Change the breath, and you send a message into all of that, in a language older than words. It is no surprise, then, that so many traditions which went looking for inner thresholds found the breath waiting there. In India, in China, among monastics and mystics in many places, the breath became a doorway. It was not handed down from one universal source. It was simply there, this plain bridge between the part of us that runs on its own and the part that can choose. It is one of those discoveries that seems to have been made many times over by people who never met, simply because it was always there to be found. The evidence was inside the body the whole time. All it asked for was a certain quality of noticing. Once breath enters the picture, the frame widens. Breath was only one of the tools. A whole family of them turns up again and again in distant traditions. Rhythm was one of them. A drum struck over and over until the beat stopped being something you heard and became something you were inside of. A chant, the same phrase repeated past the point of boredom, past the point of meaning, until the words dissolved and something opened behind them. Movement carried it further, dancing until the body tired and the ordinary self loosened its grip, spinning in some traditions slow and sustained, until the world turned into something else, swaying, turning, rocking. The same slow motions that quiet a crying child, scaled up and carried into ritual. It is not an accident that we rock the grieving as well as the young. The body seems to already know what the motion does, and beyond technique altogether, there was simple subtraction. Darkness, fasting, long silence. Take away the ordinary world signals, the food, the light, the sound, the talk, and the mind, stripped of its usual furniture, starts to show you other things. People went looking for that on purpose, into caves, into the desert, into small dark rooms built for exactly this reason, and there were states the body entered on its own, without any technique at all, that the ancients seem to have treated with the same seriousness. Grief is one. Deep grief is not an ordinary state of mind. Time bends inside it. The familiar world goes flat and strange. People speak of moving through the days underwater, of the dead feeling closer than the living. The old rituals did not try to hurry anyone out of that state. They built containers for it. The wake, the morning song, the days of sitting together, as though grief were a country you had to be walked through, not rushed past. Birth is another. For most of human history it was the great threshold, dangerous and overwhelming, where a person crossed into an altered state whether they wanted to or not, and sometimes did not cross back. Around it too the old cultures built ritual and attention and a particular kind of care. We often file all of this under a single word, trance, and then set it aside as something primitive, something other people did long ago before they knew better. But look at what these techniques actually are. They are ways of changing consciousness without changing your surroundings, tools for shifting the mind using nothing but the body and its attention. Think of it as a kind of technology, not the technology of metal and machines, but an older kind, a technology of attention, knowledge, passed down and refined over generations about how to work the instrument of the human mind. Which breath does what? Which rhythm carries a group somewhere? How long the silence has to last before it changes you? This was real knowledge, hard won and carefully kept, even if it left no machines behind for us to dig up. Underneath all of it is a quieter realization. We often think there is one right way for a mind to be: awake, alert, focused, getting things done. We treat that state as simply normal, and every other state as a deviation from it, a distraction, a lapse, something to correct. The ancients do not seem to have believed that at all. They seem to have understood the mind as a house with many rooms. The sharp, working, daylight mind was one of them, and a useful one. But it was not the whole house, and it was not always the most important room to be in. There was a mind for grief, and they entered it on purpose, together with rhythm and sound. There was a mind for celebration, and one for mourning the dead, and one for facing what frightened them. Each had its doorway. Each could be entered if you knew the way in. We have kept the rooms and lost most of the doors. The states still exist in us. We still grieve, still lose ourselves in music, still fall into the strange open time of a long walk. We simply arrive there by accident now, and leave the same way, without ever having learned the paths. And this reframes something we started with, all the way back at the beginning. When we imagine the lost powers of ancient people, we picture power over the world, moving objects, bending nature, commanding the storm. But what if some ancient powers were not powers over the world, but powers over attention, the power to gather a frightened group and steady it, the power to sit with grief without being destroyed by it, the power to shift your own mind, on purpose, from one room to another, the power to be fully present in a moment instead of scattered across 100 of them. Those are real powers. We have simply stopped counting them as powers because they do not look like power to us. They move nothing in the visible world. They lift no weight, break no rule of nature, win no argument. They only change the one who has them. And perhaps that is exactly why we overlooked them. We were busy looking outward, for power over things, and missed the quieter kind that faces the other way. Perhaps trance was never an escape from the body. Perhaps it was a deeper entrance into it. The body did not have to leave the earth to become strange. It only had to be listened to closely enough for long enough that its ordinary borders began to soften. By then, the pattern is clearer. By now the pattern has sharpened. The body as temple, throat, chest, belly, the places where a life is felt, the dreaming rooms of old healing temples where people lay still and waited to be spoken to, breath, drum, and long silence becoming doorways into other rooms of the mind. All of it points the same way, toward a kind of attention we have mostly let go of, a trained, patient relationship with the body and its thresholds, practiced across thousands of quiet mornings and darker nights. No magic has been required, a knot in the throat, a dark room and a waited for dream, a breath slowed on purpose, a drum and a circle and the ordinary self loosening its grip. These are real, human, available. They have also grown fainter in a life spent mostly indoors, mostly lit, mostly rushing, mostly alone. At that point, the direction changes. A body trained to listen this closely does not just hear itself. An instrument tuned this finely picks up more than its own strings. It would be easy, after all this inward turning, to think the whole story lives behind the eyes, but it does not. Soon we will turn the other way and step back out, into daylight and weather, and the movement of animals, and all the small signs in the living world that this same instrument was once able to read. The attention we have been describing was never meant only for the inner dark. It faced outward too, into a world that the ancients seem to have found far more talkative than we do. If the body could be trained to listen inward, it could also be trained to listen outward. The same stillness that waited for a dream could also wait, at the edge of a forest, for the moment the birds went quiet. The same attention that followed the breath could follow the smell of coming rain, or the change in an animal's step. Once the body's understood as an instrument of attention, the next question opens on its own. What else was that instrument once able to hear? You step out past the last of the trees into an open field. The grass is still wet from the night and one stem lies bent the wrong way. Somewhere ahead, mid-song, a bird stops. There is no music cue for a moment like that, just a small absence where a sound had been. That is all that happens. No flash of movement, no sound of danger, just silence in one particular direction, spreading outward the way a stone's ripple spreads across still water. Most of us would not notice it at all, but something older in us already has. Before the thinking mind can explain why, some quieter system has registered that the morning has changed shape. The same attention now turns outward. The first part of the journey was about a lost sense of the self. Now the story moves to everything just outside it. The world was never quiet, it is still talkative. We may be among the first generations of humans in the long span of our species who have mostly stopped listening to it. The same instrument that felt breath and dream could also meet wind, animal movement, weather, and the long conversation the world was always having, whether anyone happened to be listening or not. Think about someone who has spent an entire life outdoors, a tracker, say, moving through the same stretch of land for 40 years. To us the ground looks empty. To them it is covered in sentences. A bent blade of grass tells them which way something walked and roughly how long ago. Disturbed dust keeps the weight and gait of an animal the rest of us would step over without a thought. A broken twig, snapped at a certain height, rules out one animal and points toward another. There may be nothing cinematic about it at all. A smear, a print half ruined by wind, a fly moving over damp soil. That is closer to reading than guessing. Some trackers could follow a single animal for days, across ground that told most people nothing at all. Not just where the animal had gone, but roughly when, how fast, how frightened, and often why. A change in stride length could mean the animal had smelled something. A shift toward thicker cover could mean it already knew it was being followed. Time did the work. After enough seasons, patterns that once looked random began to read like a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And there was a reason this mattered so much. A missed sign in this kind of work was not an abstract mistake. It could mean a wasted day, a hungry family, or in the wrong circumstance, real danger. Attention like this was not a hobby. It was survival, practiced daily until it stopped feeling like effort at all. We do something similar every day without noticing. A tightness around someone's eyes, a breath held half a second too long, a shift in posture across a room. We read all of it instantly and call the result a feeling, when really it is closer to comprehension. A whole language, written in grass and dust and broken stems, spoken by the land itself to anyone patient enough to learn its grammar. We call this instinct sometimes as though it arrived without effort. It rarely did. Most of what looked like instinct from the outside was closer to fluency, the kind that only shows up after so much practice that the effort behind it stops being visible, even to the person doing it. But tracking on the ground was only ever half of it. The real skill was never one clue at a time. It was everything read together. Birds are one of the oldest alarms in the world. A sudden hush moving through a tree line usually means something has appeared that the birds can see and we cannot. Hunters have used this for as long as there have been hunters, not because they could read minds, but because they had spent years learning to read birds. And birds are more specific than a single alarm bell. Many species use different calls for different threats. One sound for a hawk overhead, a completely different one for a predator moving through the undergrowth. Learn that vocabulary, and a forest stops being background noise. It becomes a running report on everything moving through it, delivered for free all day long to anyone who knows how to listen. Modern researchers who study these calls closely are, in a sense, only now catching up to something old hunters already knew by ear. The forest was never quiet. It was narrating itself the entire time. Herd animals do something similar. Before a storm breaks, cattle and horses can grow restless. Ears turn, weight shifts, tails flick harder than usual. A low unease moves through the group until the whole herd seems to be facing the same direction, for a reason a stranger cannot name. A shepherd who has spent years with the same flock can feel that mood change before a single cloud has gathered. Not because the animals are magic, and not because the shepherd is either. Both of them have simply spent enough seasons together that a change in the ordinary rhythm now stands out immediately, the way a single wrong note stands out in a song you know by heart. The caution matters here. Animals do not reliably predict earthquakes, storms days in advance, or disasters on command. The evidence for such claims is mixed, and any documentary that promises certainty is overselling the story. Still, many animals do respond to small shifts in pressure, sound, smell, and movement earlier than we typically do, and people who lived closely with them learn to read those responses. Which is why the old hunters were never really watching the prey alone. They were watching the whole field around it, the birds overhead, the grass underfoot, the herd's shifting weight, even the direction of the wind against their own skin, because a scent carried the wrong way could end a hunt before it began. The animal in front of them was only one part of a much larger sentence. The landscape supplied the rest of the grammar, where water pooled, where cover thinned, where a nervous animal would naturally choose to run. Understanding the animal meant understanding the ground it moved through, almost as well as the animal understood it itself. Fishermen learned a version of the same skill, the colour of the water, the shape of a cloud bank on the horizon, the particular way the wind smells just before it turns, a change in how birds work the surface of the sea, diving in one place instead of scattering, could mean a shoal of fish had moved beneath them. information no sonar was needed to gather. It was pattern, gathered slowly, across thousands of ordinary mornings on the same stretch of coast, until the sea stopped looking uniform and started looking like something with moods and habits and a memory of its own. They would probably not have called themselves gifted. Experienced, yes. The distance between those words is smaller than we like to think. We still carry small pieces of this even now. A dog owner who somehow knows their dog is about to get up and move before there is any visible sign of it. That strange, specific stillness in the air right before it rains. Most of us would call this a feeling. It may be information, just not the kind we were trained to notice receiving. There is a similar thing that happens in a crowded room. Someone walks in, says nothing, and somehow the whole mood of the room shifts before a single word is spoken. We read posture, pace, the set of a jaw, without ever deciding to. It is the same old machinery, running quietly under a different roof. Experienced nurses report something close to this too, a sense that a patient is about to decline, hours before the monitors agree with them. Ask how they know, and the honest answer is usually that they cannot fully say. Thousands of small, half-remembered cases have quietly built a pattern no single memory holds on its own. We like to call it a sixth sense. More likely it was the other 5 finally being used properly. Knowledge like this did not live in a book. It could not. It lived in the repeated act of walking beside someone older, watching what they noticed, asking why, and being shown rather than told. A child might spend years tagging along before being trusted to read a track alone. There was no shortcut through that apprenticeship, and no substitute for the hours it took. Now picture that trained attention, not in one person, but across an entire camp, multiplied across generations, passed from an elder to a child on 100 ordinary mornings that no one thought to write down, because at the time none of it felt remarkable at all. It didn't come easily. It took years of exposure and often necessity, the kind that comes from a family's next meal depending on getting it right. Nobody was born reading a forest. They were raised inside one, paying a very close and very patient kind of attention for longer than most of us now spend on anything at all. It was not magic, and it never needed to be. It was literacy in a language most of us have stopped speaking. We often imagine ancient people staring up at an indifferent, silent world, guessing at forces they could not understand. The evidence points somewhere else. For most of human history, the world was not silent at all. It was closer to crowded, full of signals, most of them small, most of them ordinary, and almost all of them eventually readable. And if the living world could be read this closely, a natural question follows. Were all places read the same way? Or did some of them, over time, come to feel different from the rest? You duck under a low stone overhang and step into the mouth of a cave. The air changes first. Cooler, mineral, strangely still. Your own breathing sounds too loud, and for a second you become aware of the wet mark your hand has left on the rock. Nothing about this place needs to announce itself as special. The hillside is only a few steps behind you. Still, your body has already responded. So here is an old question, and a fair one. Did ancient people find invisible lines of energy running through the earth? Or did they discover something else instead? That certain places, for reasons we can actually explain, change the way the human mind behaves. We are not going to claim the first, but the second is worth a closer look. Let's be precise about the language here because it matters. We're not talking about a measurable energy field, the kind a physicist could detect with an instrument. We're talking about something harder to put a number on, a charge, a presence, an intensity that certain locations seem to carry for human beings, felt often enough, in enough different cultures, that it is useful to ask what such places do to attention. The interesting question is not whether people feel it. Clearly they do. The interesting question is what produces it. And the honest answer, it turns out, is not one thing. It is several ordinary things arriving together in the same spot until the spot itself starts to feel like more than geography. Start with height. A mountain is one of the oldest thresholds in human experience, the point where solid ground meets open sky. Stand at a high enough point and the ordinary rules of a landscape seem to loosen. The wind changes, the air thins. Whole valleys, rivers and forests that once felt enormous suddenly look small enough to hold in view all at once. In many distant cultures, mountains became meeting places between the human world and something above it, homes for ancestors, gods, or the dead. You do not need a hidden energy field to explain that. You only need eyes, a horizon, and the very old human habit of looking up when the ground finally runs out. There is an orientation function buried inside all of this too. A visible peak lets a traveller know exactly where they are, from almost anywhere in a landscape, without needing anything more than their own eyes. Long before maps existed on paper, mountains were already serving as one. Fix points a person could walk toward or away from, or use to find their way home in the dark. Caves work the opposite way. Step far enough inside one, and the world outside stops existing. No wind, no birds, no horizon, only stone pressing close on every side, and the sound of your own pulse suddenly audible in your ears. It's easy to see why so many cultures treated caves as entrances, not simply into rock, but into memory, into the underworld, into the realm of ancestors, in places with no connection to one another. Something about total darkness and total enclosure does something consistent to the human nervous system, whether the year is 30,000 years ago or last Tuesday. The heartbeat rises. The senses narrow and sharpen at once. A kind of quiet the outside world almost never offers finally becomes possible. There is also sound to consider. A cave, a canyon, a chamber of standing stone. Each one bends sound differently, and the human ear notices immediately, even without knowing why. An echo returning from stone can make a small group of people feel, without anyone saying it aloud, that the space itself is listening back. And it is not just enclosure that moves the mind. The opposite does too. Stand somewhere open enough, a wide plain, a cliff top, a beach with no lights for miles, and the sheer amount of visible sky can produce something close to the same effect as a cave, arrived at from the other direction. Enough stars and enough silence, and the ordinary sense of a fixed, solid self tends to loosen a little, on its own, without any ritual required. Most of us rarely get the chance to test this anymore. Our nights are simply too bright. One grounded way to ask the question is not whether these places are magical, but what they do to attention, memory, and the body's baseline sense of safety. Springs were treated as sacred almost everywhere water was scarce, for the simple reason that water is life, made suddenly and visibly present out of dry ground, often the only reliable source for miles, and therefore the one place a traveller could be certain other people and other animals would eventually arrive too. Places where two rivers met often became meeting places for people too. The geography made the choice for them, long before any ritual did. A confluence was already a crossroads. Humans simply gathered there and then returned. Volcanoes and cliffs made danger visible in a way that demanded respect, whether or not anyone understood the geology underneath it. A place that could kill you, in full view, tends to earn a certain kind of attention. Islands became separated worlds, set apart by nothing more mysterious than water on every side, reachable, but never quite ordinary. We still do a quieter version of this ourselves. People will drive for hours just to stand at the edge of a canyon or the edge of an ocean and do nothing there but look. There is no task to complete. The place itself is the entire point. The same instinct shows up in stranger modern places too. A cathedral, a grand old library, a national park overlook where someone has dropped a plastic water bottle beside the rail. Different centuries, different reasons given, and still the behaviour repeats. People travel somewhere, stand still, and let a place do something to them. Height, darkness, water, danger, separation. Different landscapes, each pressing on the human nervous system in a different way, yet often leading people toward the same old conclusion. This place is not ordinary. There was a practical layer to all of this too, easy to overlook. A mountain visible from 3 valleys away is also a landmark. A spring in dry country is also, quite literally, the difference between life and death. Long before any place was called sacred, it may simply have been essential. Remembered first because forgetting it could kill you, and only later wrapped in story and ritual on top of that older, harder memory. Pilgrimage routes may be the clearest evidence of all. Long walks, often physically demanding, taken again and again by different generations toward the same distant point. Feet on packed earth, mile after mile, the same turns in the road worn down by centuries of the same footsteps. The destination mattered. But so, it seems, did the walking itself. A way of carrying memory into the body one step at a time, rather than simply reading about a place second-hand. Put all of this together, and a sacred place starts to look less like a location with hidden powers, and more like a meeting point between a landscape and the very old, very consistent way a human nervous system responds to it. Our own change is easy to miss. Most of us now navigate by a small glowing arrow instead of a memorized skyline. We arrive at places without noticing the ground change beneath our feet. The destination survives. The long act of getting there, the part that once taught a landscape to a person, one step at a time, has mostly been removed. A place does not need magic to be real. Sometimes it's simply a location where a very old part of the mind finally has room to speak. No supernatural explanation is needed for any single piece of this. But add them together, height, darkness, water, danger, distance, echo, an open sky thick with stars, and you get a strong, consistent signal arriving from many directions at once in a species that was already built to notice signals. After enough returns to such a place, marking it begins to feel inevitable. Eventually, people began to mark such places. The mark did not explain the place, it remembered it. In the oldest language available, it said, "Something happens here. Remember this place," which brings us at last to stone. Picture limestone hills at first light, in that pale gold that lasts only a few minutes after sunrise. The ground is dry and bare, the wind already moving dust across it. Rising out of the hill are pillars taller than a person, cut into the shape of the letter T, arranged in wide rings that were once enclosed and may have been covered in ways we can no longer fully reconstruct. The place is Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. Wind moves almost constantly across the open ground, catching on the edges of stone exposed for thousands of years. For centuries, local farmers walked past the hill, occasionally clearing stones from their fields without suspecting what lay just beneath the surface. And for a long time, once it was finally uncovered, almost nothing about it fit the old picture. The site belongs to a period archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic, dating broadly to the 10th and 9th millennia BCE. That places it before pottery, before writing, at a moment when much of the region was still home to hunter-gatherer communities, rather than the settled farming towns we usually picture when we imagine the first great builders. To put that date in perspective, this predates Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years and the pyramids of Egypt by roughly 7,000. When these pillars were raised, the last ice age had only just loosened its grip on the world. Still, someone built it, then came back and built again. Beneath this hill are several large stone enclosures, used and eventually replaced over centuries. It was not a single monument so much as a recurring obligation, a place people returned to because whatever happened, there had not finished happening. For decades, the standard model of human history assumed a strict order of operations. First agriculture, then surplus food, then settled villages. Only after all of that, finally, monumental architecture, temples, walls, the first great public buildings. Göbekli Tepe does not follow that order. The monumental building appears to arrive first, or at least alongside the earlier steps toward farming, not clearly after it. Massive stone pillars, carefully shaped and raised, by people we once assumed were far too busy simply surviving to build anything permanent at all. Inside each enclosure, two larger pillars stand at the centre, facing each other, with smaller pillars set around them in a ring. Researchers still debate exactly what that central pair represented. Ancestors, guardians, something closer to deities, or a category we simply do not have a name for. But the arrangement itself, a deliberate core, surrounded by a deliberate boundary, suggests people who are thinking carefully about space and about how a group of bodies should be arranged within it. And the pillars are not blank. They are carved. Foxes, snakes, wild boar, birds, scorpions and other creatures, several of them clearly dangerous, arranged with obvious intention. Some pillars even seem to take the rough shape of a body, arms carved faintly along the sides, as though the stone itself were standing guard. No one can say with certainty what each animal meant to the people who carved it. Warnings, protectors, totems, jokes or fears we will never understand. More than one answer may have been true at once. A confident guess would make this tidier than it deserves to be. What does seem clear is that these animals were not decoration sprinkled on at the end. Which creature stood on which stone mattered from the beginning. That brings us back to the animal knowledge we followed earlier. These were people who had spent generations reading animals closely. Their movement, their warnings, their place in the landscape around them. It should not surprise us that when they carved meaning into stone, animals were among the first things they chose to carve. The site itself sits on a hilltop, visible from a distance, chosen the way sacred places so often were, a location that likely already felt different, long before a single stone was cut. This does not prove a lost super-civilization. There is no evidence here of advanced machinery, a hidden global network, or capabilities beyond what determined, well-organized human communities can achieve with enough time, enough shared belief, and enough willing hands. That matters. Standing in front of something this old and impressive, it is easy to reach for the biggest possible explanation, to assume that ordinary people, without metal tools, writing or wheels, could not have done this on their own. But that assumption says more about our own habits of mind than it does about them. We have grown used to measuring capability in machines. They seem to have measured it in people, patience, and time. What Göbekli Tepe shows is quieter and in its own way more interesting. Göbekli Tepe does not prove a lost super-civilization, but it does prove that our old image of primitive humanity was too small. Building something like this took more than muscle. Pillars here weigh many tons, quarried from bedrock some distance away, and moved without wheels or draft animals, using nothing but human coordination and enough hands pulling in the same direction. It took people travelling in from different places, agreeing on a shared purpose, and returning generation after generation, to keep working on something the original builders would never live to see finished. And then, strangely, they buried it. At some point, several of these great stone enclosures appear to have been deliberately filled back in with rubble and soil, sealed rather than simply abandoned. No one can say for certain why. But it suggests something quietly powerful, that finishing a place for these people may have looked less like completion and more like a kind of ceremony in itself. Researchers still argue over whether a project like this required formal leadership, or whether it could have emerged from something looser, shared belief, seasonal gatherings, and enough willing hands showing up. Either answer points to the same underlying truth. Coordination on this scale is a social achievement, with or without a crown attached to it. Somewhere in that fact is a kind of answer, even if it was never carved into a single pillar. Meaning doesn't always travel with the things that survive. Sometimes it travels with the people who kept showing up. That may be the real mystery of Göbekli Tepe. Not lost technology, lost social imagination, the ability to organize belief, memory, and labor around something no single person needed for their own survival. Think back to where this journey started. A feeling that could be read in the chest and throat before it had name. A dream taken seriously enough to build a temple around. A breath, a rhythm, a trance. Treated as doorways rather than distractions. None of that required stone, but all of it required exactly the kind of disciplined, patient attention that a place like this would also have demanded. The willingness to sit with something difficult, unglamorous and slow for far longer than any single lifetime could reward. Seen that way, Göbekli Tepe is not a separate mystery from everything we have already followed. It is the same capacity, turned outward and made permanent. The attention that read a body's inner weather, a flock's uneasy shifting, and a field gone suddenly quiet, was also patient and organised enough to raise pillars that would still be standing 11,000 years later. Nothing about that requires lost technology. It only requires taking seriously how much a determined, attentive species can build, once it decides something is worth building. We arrived at this chapter expecting stone. What we found underneath it was attention. The same trained noticing that once read animal tracks in the dust and sacred springs in dry country, now aimed at permanence, at making sure a place and whatever had happened there would not simply be forgotten. There is a strange comfort in that. These pillars have outlasted every language spoken by the people who raised them. Every name they used for themselves is gone, along with the stories those animal carvings were meant to tell. And still, something of their attention survives, carved into limestone facing outward, exactly where they left it, waiting for whoever happened to come next. Stand inside one of these stone enclosures today, and the wind still moves through the gaps between the pillars the same way it always did. It is easy to imagine, standing there, that the silence itself is old. When stone begins to hold memory, another question comes close behind. Not only what did these places look like, but what did they sound like? What kind of silence could a stone circle gather? What kind of echo could it return? What kind of sky did it frame above the people standing inside it? A stone place is never only seen, it is entered, heard, stood beneath. From here, the old stones begin to answer in sound, in sky, and eventually in the long memory of catastrophe. You step into a stone chamber, the ceiling low enough to make you lower your head. The air is cool and smells faintly of old rock. Your footsteps sound too large. You say something almost under your breath, perhaps only to test the room, and the wall gives it back changed. Deeper, longer, not quite your voice anymore. That is all it takes. One word, and the room replies. Were ancient temples built only to be seen? Or were some of them built to be heard? It is an easy question to overlook. Most of what survives from the ancient world reaches us through the eyes. Carvings, ruins, the shapes of walls still standing. Sound leaves nothing behind for an excavation to find. It simply happens, and then it is gone, the way it has always been gone, the moment after it occurs. From here, the question narrows to a voice in stone. What did these old places sound like to the people who stood inside them? Sound behaves differently in an enclosed stone space than it does in open air. A voice gathers. It lingers half a second longer than it should, rolling back off the walls before it has fully finished leaving your mouth. A low chant in a small chamber can be felt in the chest almost more than heard in the ears. A pressure, low and steady, moving through the ribs. No miracle is required, just stone, air, and a body with nowhere else to put its attention. Add darkness, and the effect deepens. Take away the eyes, even partly, and the ears seem to move closer to the centre of the mind. Every footstep on stone becomes an event. Every breath becomes audible, close and strangely intimate. A single held note can seem to fill the whole room from several directions at once, until it is hard to say exactly where the sound is coming from anymore. We know this feeling in smaller ways ourselves. Speak in a dark room, and your own voice can sound larger than it does in daylight. The eyes usually do a great deal of quiet work, keeping a space small and familiar. Remove that work, even briefly, and the room grows around you. No tuning forks were required, no measuring devices, only stone, a voice and darkness. 3 things ancient people had in abundance, long before anyone had a word for acoustics. Archaeoacoustics begins with this kind of question. It asks how ancient spaces sounded, and whether sound may have shaped what happened inside them. The rituals performed, the words chosen, the way a group of people felt while standing together in the dark. The limits matter. Researchers can measure how a chamber behaves today, using microphones and instruments the original builders never had. They cannot know with certainty whether an acoustic effect was designed on purpose, discovered by accident, or simply folded into ritual because people noticed what the room could do. What can be measured is still meaningful. Which pitches linger, which ones fade quickly, where a voice gathers strength, and where it disappears. Some ancient chambers respond unusually well to the low range of a human voice or a simple drum. Whether that was intention or accident, it matters that the effect was there to be noticed. In Malta, there is a prehistoric underground space called the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum, carved directly into limestone bedrock thousands of years ago, chamber leading into chamber beneath the surface. Visitors and researchers have long noted how certain rooms there seem to hold and deepen a low voice, as if the stone were gathering the sound and giving it back. No one can prove the builders carved it for that purpose. Intent is one of the hardest things to recover from stone alone. But it is hard to stand in a room like that, feeling a low voice fill the space so completely, and not wonder whether the people who made it felt something close to the same thing. In Ireland, there is a very different kind of structure. Newgrange is a Neolithic passage tomb built with a narrow opening above its entrance passage. For most of the year, the long stone passage inside stays dark. On mornings around the winter solstice, the rising sun can line up with that opening and send a beam of light travelling the full length of the passage, reaching the chamber at its heart. Inside the passage, on the darkest morning of the year, that arrival of light would not have felt like decoration. It would have felt like time entering the room. Newgrange belongs here carefully. Its fame rests on light, not sound. We are not claiming its builders tuned it acoustically. We are noticing something related. In both places, in different ways, stone was used to shape an experience, not just to be looked at, to be entered and felt. A painting is seen from outside, held at arm's length, always separate from the person looking at it. A place like this is not. You walk into it. It surrounds you, and whatever it does to the whole body. Ears, chest, breath, skin, the small hairs at the back of the neck. A structure built without surviving written plans can still catch a beam of sunlight on a particular winter morning, thousands of years after the people who designed it are gone. Whatever else that tells us, it tells us this. They had watched carefully for a very long time before they ever placed the first stone. This returns us to breath, rhythm, and chant as doorways into altered states. Sound was never separate from that. A chant repeated in the same stone room year after year, generation after generation, becomes something more than noise. It becomes memory with a body around it. Think about how much easier a chant is to remember than plain speech. The rhythm holds the words in place. The melody carries them forward, almost on its own, the way a familiar song can surface whole after years of not hearing it, word for word without any real effort. Before writing, repetition was memory. Sound may have been one of the oldest ways to keep memory alive, not stored on a page, but rehearsed out loud in a space built to hold it. Generation handing the same chant to generation, the room itself acting almost like a second silent participant. We still understand this without being taught. Step into a cathedral or an old stone library, and most people lower their voice. No sign tells them to. Something about the space asks, and the body answers. The room has not changed in centuries. Our instinct toward it apparently has not either. It is a strange continuity. Behaviour carried not by instruction, but by architecture. A voice in a stone chamber is never quite alone. It comes back changed, carrying something of the room itself. A person alone in the dark speaks softly, and something answers. We can call it stone doing what stone does to sound. That is accurate. It also does not explain what it feels like when your own voice comes back from the wall as if it has been somewhere else first. The returning voice, closer to an echo of the self than a separate reply, may have been part of what these spaces offered. A place where a person could speak and hear the self come back larger, altered by the room. Stone gave sound a body. Seen that way, old structures look less like silent monuments and more like instruments in the broadest sense. Places built not just to be seen, but to hold a voice, a chant, a held breath in the dark. Stone did not just hold sound. Some of it held light, horizon, time. Picture a sky with no electric light beneath it. No street lamps, no porch lights, no dull town glow on the horizon. Just stars in numbers most of us have never actually seen, filling the dark until looking up for too long makes the neck ache and the body feel smaller than it expected. For nearly all of human history this was simply the sky, ordinary, every clear night. To us the night sky is often background, something glimpsed between buildings, mostly ignored, a pretty backdrop for a walk home rather than a source of information. Most of us could not point to true north using the stars if our safety depended on it. Most of us could not say, with any confidence, what phase the moon is in without checking a screen. To the people who lived under that sky fully, none of that would have made sense. It may have been calendar, compass and memory at once, read constantly, the way we read the signals of our own age, except this one returned without being summoned. Before writing covered the earth, the sky may have been one of humanity's oldest archives. Start with the stars themselves. Without written records, how do you remember 100 generations of knowledge? One old answer is that you do not store the pattern on a page. You store it overhead, where it returns night after night. Stars were not decoration. They were structure, fixed points a person could learn once as a child and rely on for an entire lifetime, the way we might rely on the layout of a familiar house in the dark. Unlike almost everything else in A Life Without Writing, the sky returned with a steadiness few things in human life could match. It could be checked against itself, again and again. The horizon did real work too. Watch where the sun rises across a full year, and it does not stay in one place. It drifts north along the hills, reaches a farthest point, pauses there for a few mornings, and then slowly reverses, drifting south again. A community that tracked that drift over many years could know when the season was turning. A single fixed marker, a notch in a distant ridge, a particular gap between two hills, was often enough. Watch the sunrise creep toward that marker year after year, and you have built a calendar without a single written number. The landscape itself begins to keep time. The moon added a faster rhythm underneath that slower one. Full, then dark, then full again, roughly 30 nights apart. A reliable count any culture could use to measure shorter stretches of time between one event and the next. And certain stars did something almost like keeping an appointment. For most of the year, a given star might rise only in daylight, invisible against the brightness of the sun, and go unnoticed entirely. Then, on a particular morning, it would finally appear again, low on the horizon just before sunrise, visible again for the first time in months. In more than one ancient culture, that first reappearance came to mark the start of a season. Flooding, harvest, migration, the beginning of a journey. The sky was giving useful information, and people had learned patiently over generations to read it. This did not require telescopes or modern theory. It required the willingness to look at the same patch of sky for years and to pass the pattern on carefully enough that someone else could trust it. In a sense, this was astronomy in its oldest form. Not equations, not telescopes, but disciplined watching. Not abstraction, but attention carried across generations. One more layer needs caution. Over long stretches of time, the sky changes in ways too slow for a single lifetime to notice directly. One of those changes is precession, the slow wobble in Earth's axis that gradually shifts the backdrop of the stars over a cycle of roughly 26,000 years. Later astronomers identified this drift by comparing observations across time, but it is also a topic that gets overstated. Not every ancient myth encodes precession. Not every monument was built around it. Most ancient sky watching was not a hidden code. It was patient attention to cycles that mattered. Still, the very possibility of noticing changes that slow is humbling. A reminder that patience, sustained long enough and carried carefully enough, becomes its own kind of instrument. Myths did practical work here. A story is easier to remember than a list. Try memorizing 40 unrelated facts, and then try remembering a story with 40 small details woven into it. The story almost always wins. Give the stars characters, feuds, journeys, and homecomings, and a season's worth of knowledge can travel inside something a child wants to hear again, requested at the fire without anyone needing to insist on it. Oral cultures were not simply talking. They were building memory out of rhythm, repetition, and vivid image. A good storyteller was not just an entertainer. They were a living archive, trusted to keep a community's most useful knowledge intact and pass it on before it vanished. Of course, we do not know how much of any single myth reflects astronomical observation and how much is story for its own sake. The two were probably never fully separate. That separation may be more modern than ancient. We sought fact and fiction, science and story into different rooms. For much of human history, the sky held them together. We have lost much of this without noticing. Many people alive today have never seen the full arc of the Milky Way. Too much light rises from our cities now, an artificial glow along the horizon, drowning out the archive that once anchored so much human knowledge. Step far enough from a city on a truly dark night, and the change can be startling. The sky does not look like it has gained a few extra stars. It looks like a different sky entirely. Thick, layered, and strange. Closer to what most humans who ever lived would have called ordinary. A star was not just a light. It was a date returning, arriving on schedule, whether or not anyone remembered to expect it. The sky did not need paper. It repeated itself, faithfully, for anyone patient enough to keep watching night after night, year after year, asking nothing in return except attention. And then the question turns downward. The sky, for all its slow drifting, still felt steady to the people who watched it. But the ground beneath them did not always stay where memory expected it to be. What happens to a shared archive when the coastline itself begins to move? Picture water moving over ground that used to be dry. Not one cinematic wave, not the clean drama of a wall of water, but a shoreline that creeps inland year after year. Grass gives way to reeds. Reeds give way to mud. Mud becomes open water, and people learn to pretend this is normal because they have no choice. A grandfather points toward the sea and tells his grandchildren there used to be a valley there. They hunted along that river, he says, where the current is now. He remembers fires, a bend in the bank, a place where the ground dipped and held rain after storms. The children mostly watch his hand. To them there is only open water, gulls, and an old man's insistence that something invisible was once solid. The children do not really understand it. How could they? To them, the sea has always simply been there, exactly where it is now. It is only the old man's memory that holds the difference. A valley on one side of his life, and water on the other. This happened in many places, across a long stretch of human history. After the last ice age reached its coldest point, global sea levels began to rise, eventually climbing by roughly 120 meters over many thousands of years as enormous ice sheets across the northern continent slowly melted into the surrounding seas. That number is difficult to picture. 120 meters is taller than most cathedrals. Land that people once walked across, hunted across, perhaps buried their dead in, now sits that far beneath the surface of the sea. Somewhere that is now open ocean, a fire once burned on dry ground. Families gathered near it, and today, fish move through the space where that fire used to be, over ground no human eye has seen in thousands of years. One of the clearest examples is a place now called Doggerland, a wide stretch of land that once connected what is now Britain to continental Europe. It was not a narrow land bridge. For thousands of years it was a real landscape in its own right, with rivers, low hills, forests and marshland stretching for a considerable distance beneath what is now open sea. Fishing trawlers working that stretch of water have pulled up mammoth bones, ancient antlers, and worked flint tools from the seabed. Ordinary evidence of ordinary life on ground that has not existed above water for thousands of years. A tool shaped by human hands caught in a net far from shore is a quiet reminder that this was once familiar land. Doggerland did not vanish all at once. It shrank gradually as the surrounding seas rose, the coastline retreating a little more with each generation. But its final disappearance may have come suddenly, in the end. Evidence suggests a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway triggered a tsunami across the North Sea, perhaps overwhelming whatever low ground was still left. If that is what happened, A place that had been slowly shrinking for thousands of years may have ended, for whoever remained near it, in a single terrible afternoon. A slow loss, closed by one violent day. Both kinds of catastrophe can belong to the same place. On the other side of the world, something similar happened on a much larger scale. During the depths of the last ice age, so much water was locked into glaciers that global sea levels were far lower than today, and a huge landmass called Sundaland stood exposed across what is now Southeast Asia. River systems, lowland forest and open plains, where today there is mostly open sea between separate islands. As the ice melted, the ocean slowly reclaimed most of it, over thousands of years, leaving behind the scattered islands we now call Indonesia, Malaysia, and their neighbours. What is now a region defined by water was once, for a very long time, defined by connected land. Language matters here. Neither Doggerland nor Sundaland were lost civilizations, in the sense of grand cities or hidden technology waiting to be found. They were something quieter, and in some ways sadder. Lost worlds, hunting grounds, river valleys, shorelines, camps, and routes now permanently out of reach. Ordinary human life, going on as it always had until the water arrived. A slow catastrophe changes memory differently. A sudden disaster can be told as a single event. It happened, it ended, and the story stays fairly simple. But this kind of change moves slower than one human life. No one who watched it begin also watched it finish. A person born beside a river might grow old and die, having watched that river's mouth widen a little, its banks retreat a little without ever seeing anything they would call a disaster. Only their grandchildren, comparing their own childhood memory of the coast to what an elder once described, would start to notice that something large had actually happened. So the only way to understand it across a community was to pass it down. A grandmother's account of the coastline as it once was, told to a child who would later describe a shoreline they had never seen. Slow change like this can still become myth, precisely because it outlives any one witness. By the time the story has passed through several generations, the ordinary retreat of a coastline can start to sound, quite understandably, like something the world once did to punish, or warn, or test the people living through it. This may be part of why flood stories appear in so many places, not because they all preserve one perfect memory of one event, but because water has repeatedly remade the edges of human worlds. Something broader is enough. Coastlines disappeared in different places at different times, and stories of those losses could settle into forms sturdy enough to survive after the original details had softened. Here the ground has to stay steady. No single global flood, no proven comet-destroyed civilization. A debated idea, sometimes called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, circulates among some researchers, but it remains unsettled. Other scientists read the evidence differently. We do not need that argument to be settled for the larger point to stand. Dramatic climate change, rising seas, and disappearing coastlines are not in dispute. The ancient world did not have to invent apocalypse from nothing. It had already watched land disappear within the memory of its own families. The sea does not just cover land, it covers memory. It removes the ordinary layers of soil, ash, and worked stone that archaeologists might otherwise study on dry ground. Salt water is not a gentle archive. Some traces remain, a scatter of tools here, a shaped piece of antler there, a bone lifted back into daylight by accident. Each one quietly confirms that a world was there. A drowned coastline does not have to be Atlantis to be heartbreaking. It only has to have been someone's home, no golden city required, only a fire, a family and a shoreline that no longer exists. We know a distant version of this feeling even now, wherever shorelines shift within a single lifetime, the old place named by memory while the water keeps moving. The causes and scale are different, but the human experience is recognizable, trying to explain a changing edge of the world to children who will inherit a different coastline. Many lost worlds were not cities at all. They were hunting grounds, river mouths, campsites, burial places, paths home. Ordinary places made precious because someone once knew them by heart. Catastrophe does not always arrive as a single wave. Sometimes it arrives as a shoreline moving a little farther away each year, until one day a grandparent points at open water and tries to explain what used to be there. But disappearance is not the whole story. When land disappears, some things are carried inland. Stories, warnings, names of places no one can visit anymore. Songs built to hold a vanished coastline. Star paths still pointing the old way after the ground beneath them has changed. And in every generation, there are people old enough and attentive enough to remember how things used to be, carrying an entire vanished world in memory alone. In such a world, the vital people were not always the strongest or richest, but the ones who remembered. Somewhere, perhaps, that grandfather from the beginning of this chapter was exactly that person, the one describing a valley that no longer existed, keeping it alive in the only place it could still survive, not on a map, in a voice, by a fire, passed to children who would one day tell it themselves. And after the waters rose, after the old paths ended at the shore, the most important people in the world may have been those who could still remember the way back. The water is behind them now, a whole community moving inland, carrying what they could. Picture them stopping at nightfall on higher ground. Someone builds a fire, it smokes badly before it catches. Children gather close, tired from walking, one of them picking mud from a toenail with a stick. Somewhere in that circle sits an old person who remembers the place they just left, the one now underwater, behind them, in the dark. That old person is about to become the most important thing the group still has. Think about what they actually carried out, these survivors. Not much, probably. Whatever hands could hold while walking. A few tools, some food, a child on a hip. The heavy things, the built things, the things that took a lifetime to make, all of that stayed behind under the rising water. What they carried instead was lighter, and in some ways worth more. It weighed nothing at all, and it lived entirely in their heads. Children born after the loss will never see the old coastline. To them, the sea has always ended where it ends today. The valley their grandparents hunted is already a story, not a memory. Something they have to be told rather than something they know. Once a place lives only in the teller becomes precious. There is something sad in this, and not neatly sad either. A child sits by the fire, half listening, half poking at ash, while an old person describes a valley the child will never walk through. The place is gone, but not entirely. It has moved into a voice, which is a fragile place to keep anything. By now, the pieces are familiar. The body's quiet signals, the rhythm around a shared fire, the reading of animals and weather, the feel of a sacred place, the turning of the sky. All of it, in the end, lived in people, and had to be handed person to person or lost. Think about what that elder actually holds, where the rivers used to run, where the animals crossed and in which season, which plants eased a fever and which ones killed, which star rose just before the rains, where the old paths went, and why some of them should never be walked alone. There is no page to lose and no page to recover it from. It exists in exactly one place, a human memory, seated by a fire, speaking to whoever is willing to listen. We tend to think of a library as a building. For most of human history, a library had knees that hurt in cold weather, a favourite story, a temper, a cough, a memory that could fail at the worst possible time. It walked, aged, and eventually died. A whole way of knowing the world could vanish in a single winter if the right person was lost before the right child was ready to listen. Now widen the picture. One elder, one fire, one night is a small scene, almost too small to matter, but multiply it across a region, over generations, as coastlines moved and communities pulled back from the water again and again. Thousands of fires, thousands of elders, each one a fragile point where the past was being handed to the future, and where, just as easily, it could have been dropped. Human history, seen this way, is not really a chain of kings and battles. It is a chain of quiet handoffs, most of which no one recorded, most of which held. After catastrophe, knowledge becomes sacred because forgetting becomes dangerous. When a world breaks, memory stops being a luxury. It becomes a survival tool as real as a spear or a store of grain. The person who remembers is not decoration. They are necessary, load-bearing in their own way as rusty wall or bridge. We do not think of memory this way now. We have outsourced much of it. To books, to records, to the glowing devices in our pockets that remember so much for us. For most of human history there was no backup. There was only the person, what the person had learned, and whether they lived long enough to pass it on. From there, an old and tempting image appears, the teacher after the flood. In many traditions, a figure appears after a great disaster and teaches the survivors how to farm, how to read the sky, how to build, how to heal, how to live rightly. A bringer of knowledge, arriving when knowledge is most needed. The details vary. Sometimes the teacher is human, sometimes half divine, sometimes rising from the water, sometimes descending from the sky. But the shape returns often enough to be interesting. First a flood, or fire, or an ending of the old world, then the hard work of beginning again, and somewhere inside, that rebuilding, someone who knows what must not be forgotten. It is tempting to ask whether such figures remember something literal, a person, a lineage, a particular survivor whose name grew brighter with every retelling. It is also easy to reach for the largest possible explanation. Survivors of a vanished advanced civilization, perhaps, carrying their lost wisdom to simpler people. It makes for a thrilling story. It has been told many times, but look closer and a quieter explanation fits better. It asks for no lost empire, no vanished super race, no visitors from anywhere. It also honours the people involved far more than the grander version ever could. The teacher after the flood need not be a stranger from a lost empire. It may be the oldest person in the camp, the one who lived long enough to remember the world before and cared enough to hand it on. We do not need to imagine outsiders arriving to civilize anyone. That framing gets the dignity exactly backward. It quietly assumes that ordinary people could not have known their own world, could not have rebuilt their own lives, without some superior visitor to show them how. The more generous reading points the other way. The knowledge that helped communities recover was often their own, held by their own elders, carried in their own stories, recovered from their own memory of the world before. Nobody had to hand it to them from above. They had kept it through the worst thing that had happened to them. And there were many kinds of these memory bearers, not one wise figure standing above the rest, but a whole quiet library of them, spread out across the ordinary people who survived, each one holding a different section of everything the group needed to know. The storyteller was one, holding the names of places no one could visit anymore, the shape of a lost coastline preserved in language, the warnings folded so neatly into a tale that a child would ask to hear them again, never knowing they were being handed a map. The healer was another, remembering which plant eased a fever and which one stopped a heart, when to gather each, which part to use, and how much was too much. An entire pharmacy, carried in a single trained memory, with no label on any of it but the words of the person who taught them, who had it from the person before, back and back through a line no one had ever written down. The tracker held the animals, their movements, their seasons, the signs that meant safety or danger. The midwife held the births, the complications, the quiet, hard-won knowledge of how to bring a new life safely into a frightened world. The skywatcher held the seasons themselves, the star that marked the flood, the slow rhythm overhead that the ground could no longer be trusted to keep. Each of them was an archive with a heartbeat, warm, mortal, irreplaceable, and each of them, if they died before passing it on, could take a whole room of knowledge with them, a library lost to fire quietly in the dark. Oral transmission is fragile in exactly that way. Everything depends on the handoff. The young person listening at the right moment, the elder living long enough and staying clear enough to give the thing away before they go. That may be why communities often ritualize knowledge after hard times, why certain things had to be said a certain way, in a certain order, at a certain season, with little room for improvisation. From outside, that strictness can look like superstition. Up close, it looks more like a backup system. Ritual is not just worship. It is also a method of remembering, a way of locking a fragile piece of knowledge into a form stable enough to survive one more generation. Change as little as possible, and the chances of losing the thread become smaller. So the better question may not be which flood myth is literally true, or which teacher figure really existed. The better question is why so many stories imagine wisdom in this shape, as something given, rescued, or remembered after the world has broken. Perhaps because that is genuinely how it felt. Again and again in real life, knowledge really did have to be carried through disaster by someone who remembered. The myth is not a record of a single event. It is the shape of a thing that happened, quietly, countless times. So we can set the grander theory gently aside. We do not need a lost empire to explain the teachers after the flood. The real pattern is more human, and in a way more moving. When the world breaks, the people who remember become sacred, not because they came from somewhere magical, but because they carried something across the break that no one else could carry. A story can behave like a boat. It carries something fragile across the gap between a world that ended and a world still finding its feet. Unlike a real boat, it can hand the cargo to everyone who hears it and still keep carrying it. There is a familiar old image that fits here. An ark, a vessel that carries life across a flood into whatever comes after. But not every ark carries animals. Some carry names, roots, songs, warnings, ways of seeing the world that would otherwise have drowned with the coastline and never come back. The most important thing, saved from a disaster, is not always a tool, or a seed, or a treasure. Sometimes it is a person who remembers, and a young person willing to listen. We are not so different now, though we hide it better. When an elder in any family dies, something goes with them that no photograph quite holds. The sound of a voice, the exact way a story was told, small knowledge that was never written down because it never occurred to anyone that it might be lost. Every family is, in its own quiet way, still afire with someone old beside it. Meaning doesn't always travel with the things that survive. Sometimes it travels only with the people who remember. Which leaves us with one last question, the one this whole journey has been circling. If these teachers carried something forward, across every flood and every rupture, across thousands of years and countless quiet fires all the way down to us, what exactly was it? A technology, a map, a secret power, or something quieter and much harder to lose completely, not an object at all? a way of being human that still exists in scattered fragments inside us, waiting, like everything else in this story, to be remembered rather than rediscovered. That is the question the whole journey has been walking toward. It is where we end. Return now to the promise we started with, back at the beginning of this journey. The old promise is easy to understand: telepathy, objects moving under the pressure of thought, hidden energies, secret abilities, some earlier version of humanity that could do what we cannot. It is a powerful dream, and I understand the pull of it. It is easier to believe a birthright was stolen than to face the smaller, more irritating possibility that people set certain things down because they were busy, tired, rewarded for speed, or simply looking somewhere else. It has followed us through this entire journey, just beneath the surface. And before we close, we owe it an honest answer. Here it is, plainly, without drama, and without any wish to flatten the wonder. Modern science has not established telepathy as a real, repeatable ability. The same is true of telekinesis, remote viewing, and the classic psychic powers. Careful testing over many years has not produced strong, generally accepted evidence that they work the way the old stories promise. To pretend otherwise would be its own kind of disrespect to the truth and to everything careful we have tried to do along the way. The wonder in this story does not need pretending. It comes from what turns out to be real. But notice something. Saying that does not close the story. It only clears the ground for the more interesting part. Those tests, though, asked a very specific question. Can a mind send information or move matter without an ordinary channel? When the answer remains no, it is easy to assume there was nothing there to find. But the older capacities we have followed were never that kind of thing. The flashy version is tempting because it promises power without relationship, telepathy without the years it takes to truly know another person, perception without patience, the reward without the 1,000 quiet mornings it actually costs. The real abilities were never like that. They could not be bought, or found, or inherited. They could only be practiced. We may have been looking for the wrong lost power all along. We kept asking whether ancient people could reach out and change the world with their minds. The sharper question is whether the world could still reach in and change them. The tragedy, then, may not be that we lost the ability to move objects with the mind. It may be that we lost the ability to be moved by the world. It turns the search around completely, away from power over things and back toward openness to them. There is a difference between acting on the world and being open to it. We have spent a few centuries getting very, very good at the first one. We have quietly forgotten the second. A civilization can gain enormous power over things, and lose, almost without noticing, its capacity to be touched by them. That may be the strangest trade our species ever made. And we made it so gradually that no single generation ever felt the loss. The real powers are less tidy than the old promise. They come back as scattered images, which is probably how memory usually works. A parent and infant with no shared language, falling into rhythm anyway. Two nervous systems learning each other so completely that, from the outside, it could almost look like reading a mind. That was real. It still happens in ordinary rooms all over the world. A circle around a fire. Many separate people breathing with the same story, held by the same drum, becoming for a while larger than their separate selves. We still feel the edges of it. In a crowd, in a song sung by thousands, in a room full of people carrying the same grief. A breath slowed on purpose, a chant repeated until something opens behind the words, a dream taken seriously enough to build a whole temple around, ways of moving between the rooms of the mind deliberately, instead of being dragged between them without a map. a tracker seeing a sentence written in dust, a shepherd feeling the herd change before a cloud has gathered, a fisherman smelling weather before it turns, not magic. Attention trained across thousands of quiet mornings, until it finally looked like something more. A cave, a mountain, a spring, a ring of standing stone. Places that could change the body before the mind had explained why. A hilltop where people raised pillars long before anyone believed such people could, and kept returning for generations because something there mattered enough to outlive them. Grief held by rhythm and song, heavy state entered together, not rushed through, not privatized, not hidden away. Pain carried by a group because everyone understood that no one should have to carry it alone. Memory without paper, a chant returning from a stone wall in the dark, a star marking the turn of a season, an old voice beside a fire carrying a drowned coastline forward, one telling at a time, and beneath all of it, the quietest power, belonging. The ability to feel part of the fire, the flock, the forest, the sky, not as a visitor passing through, but as something that genuinely belonged there. That may be the one we miss most, without having the words for it. None broke the laws of physics, none required magic. They were ordinary capacities, observable in bodies and communities, available wherever attention has time to deepen. And many of them have grown fainter in lives spent mostly indoors, mostly rushing, mostly alone, mostly looking down at a small bright screen that answers before we have finished asking. That is the quiet realization underneath all of it. We didn't lose these things in a flood, or a war, or some single catastrophe we could point to. We set them down slowly over generations in exchange for other things: comfort, speed, convenience, a world where less and less is required of our attention. It was probably not a robbery, more like a trade made in installments, so slowly that most people never noticed they were signing anything away. The lost civilization we've been chasing may not be only a place beneath the sea. It may also be a set of capacities much closer than that. Not magic, not machines, but an old, ordinary way of paying attention that we forgot was ever a skill. Ancient humans may not have lost a machine, a city, or a secret technology. What faded may have been a way of listening, to the body, to each other, to animals, weather, place, sky, the dead. 100 small channels, most of them still technically open, just no longer tuned to anything. And now, at the end, we come back to where we began. A dark room, late at night. A small screen glowing near your hand. Invisible signals moving through the walls, through your body, out past the roof, and into the sky. More connection than any human being has ever had in the whole history of the species, and underneath it all something older, gone quiet. But quiet is not the same as gone. A drowned coastline still exists under the water. A forgotten skill can remain under disuse. Nothing here was destroyed. It was set down, left alone, and slowly covered over. The body in that room is still breathing. It has been under everything this whole time, keeping its own rhythm. The throat still tightens before a hard word. The chest still opens with relief. Fear still arrives in the belly a moment before the mind can name it. The pulse keeps time, as it has since before you were born. The old instrument is still here, patient, waiting to be used for something more than carrying us from one screen to the next. It never left. It just stopped being asked for anything. Outside, past the walls, birds still fall silent and begin again with the light. The sky is still turning overhead, the same slow wheel of stars behind the glow of the streetlights, patient as ever, waiting there even when the city hides it from view. Somewhere, rain is gathering. Somewhere, an animal has gone still. The world is still talking in the old language, at the old pace. The archive did not disappear. We stopped reading it, and forgot after a while that it was ever something we knew how to read. Loss here is not always destruction. Much of it is only disuse, and disuse is not the same as disappearance. A path can vanish under grass and remain a path if someone begins walking it again. The old signals remain, whether or not anyone remembers how to read them. So the lost civilization, if that phrase still has any use by the end, is not only something beneath the sea, it is also a relationship we keep forgetting. Body to world, story to memory, attention to the living dark. It is in the body that still listens when we stop forcing it quiet. In stories that carry what no archive can hold. In the brief silence that gathers when the lights go low and the world becomes audible again. Discovery may not be the right word anymore. What remains is closer to remembering, the part of it still breathing under the noise, in the body, in the stories, in the old world still speaking around us. It is still here, not as a revelation and not as a secret, but as the ordinary world continuing to speak whether we answer or not.